Good evening. It isn't hard to think that there's something unique and indeed mysterious about the race of man. For a start, there don't seem to be others like us around. Still, large items of belief or faith that support the perception of our uniqueness and mystery have been given way. The rot set in, I suppose, when we learned from Galileo that we don't have the prime position in the universe at its center. We then turned out, or so it seems, not to be the children of God. To come up to date, no doubt what most supports our pretensions to uniqueness and mystery is the belief that our mental powers of understanding and creativity and our mental capabilities generally are our special preserve. We alone have the physical equipment, the brains, which are the means to understanding and the like. There's now an intellectual growth industry whose tendency it is to remove our claim to distinction, partly by way of a new conception of mind or mentality itself. The industry is called artificial intelligence, inspired by extraordinary developments in computer science, which some would argue are taking us into a new culture. Many who work in artificial intelligence are confident that they have a model of the mind, a model of us, which is more precise, fertile, and enlightening than anything from philosophers, from Freud, from benighted psychologists who attempt to reduce mentality to behavior, or from neuroscientists, present or future. It's certainly not a model that makes us special. There's no doubting the confidence of the new industry, the confidence of, may I say it, the artificial intelligentsia. Computers themselves are not the main interest of those who work in artificial intelligence, who seek to bring the mind out of its obscurity. They're not that much concerned with the hardware. They're quick to say that intelligence or creativity or understanding or consciousness are not to be seen at bottom in terms of mechanisms and boxes from IBM, or in terms of our brains, or in terms of any other physical structures or materials, dead or alive, constructed or evolved. The hardware, including the neural hardware in our heads, doesn't matter. It's the software that counts. A bit more precisely, it is programs that count. Very roughly, they are the rules on which computers run. They are the rules, if the proponents of artificial intelligence are right, on which we run. One question which arises for us tonight, then, is whether minds are just computer programs of certain kinds, or rather just programs, since certainly they don't need to be on computers. Can it be that the mind is yet less than a ghost in the machine, but just, as they say, an abstract sort of thing? Is it true, then, that computers have mental states, that we shall find out about our minds by studying theirs, that we shall find out about our consciousness, intelligence, creativity, presumably our desires and passions, by studying theirs, that our future is perhaps a bit uncertain, since the computers of the future will have what we have and a whole lot more of it. Professor Margaret Boden of the University of Sussex is, as I trust she won't mind my saying, the doyeness of artificial intelligence in these islands. She's lately been elected a member of the British Academy. Her books include Artificial Intelligence and Natural Man, which surveyed its subject most fully, and Minds and Mechanisms, which collects together some of her many papers. Professor John Searle of the Department of Philosophy of the University of California at Berkeley has among his present attainments this year's Reith Lectures for the BBC, and among his attainments of the past, a first-class row. It was caused by his article, Minds, Brains, and Programs, was first published in a professional journal along with 27 replies, including many from the world's leading proponents of artificial intelligence. It was and is his contention that there is no reason to suppose that computers have or ever could have thoughts or feelings. He has perhaps further doubts about artificial intelligence. He allows that a myth has grown up, the myth of the computer, but he believes that soon enough it will give way to what I'm sure he calls good sense. Could we begin, Professor Boden, with some of your views? I think it would perhaps be useful to have an idea of what you take a program to be.
Well, a program, as you said, is just a set of rules for, basically, for moving symbols about. But an AI program is a very different sort of program from the ones that we're normally used to, because an AI program is one where there is a rich representation of the world that the system is thinking about inside the program, if you like. And this is why AI is of interest to psychologists and also, I think, to philosophers of mind, because it's concentrating on what goes in between the input, the perception, if you like, and the output, the behavior. It's concentrating precisely on something which is in the same place, if you like, in the function of the organism as the mind is, something which the behaviorists, for instance, totally ignored.
Right. So programs then are at least fundamentally sets of rules, but very rich sets of rules. Is it true, in virtue of programs, that consciousness might be ascribed truly to future conceivable computers? I think you've said that they might properly be ascribed concepts. Do you stick to that view?
I think that they might properly be ascribed concepts, yes. But I think there's a difficulty with words like consciousness or even purpose and intelligence, freedom, any of these words. And that's basically not a factual difference. Not a factual difficulty, because I don't see any reason in principle to doubt that in fact you could have a computer system which had the same sorts of events going in it, computational events, which we have in our minds when we, for instance, make a free choice. I think it's a moral difficulty. I think that once you agree to take the scare quotes off, words like purpose and intelligence and freedom, and you say, if you're prepared to say that a particular computer program or robot really is free, for example, then what you're saying is that it's part of your moral universe, and that all things being equal, you've got to respect its purposes, unless they clash too much with your own. Now, I think that's a very strong moral thing to say. I personally wouldn't want to see the day in which we said that. I would want to keep a distinction between the purposes of naturally evolved creatures, including chickens and cows, and the purposes, in quotes, of artificially created creatures, such as computer programs. But I think I should say that that's my view. It certainly isn't a view that would be shared by everybody in AI. I think most people in AI would say that since I've agreed that in principle there's no factual difference here, they would want to go the whole way and say that in principle there could be a computer which was really conscious, which really had purposes, which was really intelligent.
Mm-hmm. So we think and have beliefs, and computers think in inverted commas and have beliefs in inverted commas. Is the difference between those two contentions only one of a moral character? Did I understand you?
Well, at the moment, it's a difference of fact. I mean, even the most powerful and impressive AI programs that we've got today hardly begin to scratch the surface of the sort of power and complexity that the human mind has got. So there's no question whatsoever that you can't use these terms except in a very weak sense about today's programs. Again, I personally believe that that will always be true. I don't actually believe that in practice we will ever build a computer like HAL in the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. I don't think it'll in practice happen. Again, other people would disagree with me, but I think that in principle that's possible.
Right. John Searle, you have strong views on the subject of artificial intelligence, and I think those views focus on one argument.
Yeah.
And it's something about a Chinese room.
Well, let me tell you a little bit.
I wonder if you would tell me what it aims to prove and then tell me what it is.
Okay. I like to talk about particular programs and the sort of thing that's claimed for them. So let's take as an example the Yale program at the Yale Artificial Intelligence Lab for understanding stories. That's understanding it in quotes. The way it works is this. You give the computer a story. These tend to be rather simple-minded stories. Here's a story. Man went into a restaurant and ordered a hamburger. When they brought him the hamburger, it was burned to a crisp. So the man stormed out of the restaurant without paying the bill. Now you ask the computer, did the man eat the hamburger? And lo and behold, the computer says, no, he didn't eat the hamburger. Now that's an interesting result because you remember it didn't say in the story whether or not the guy ate the hamburger.
One up for the computer.
One up for the computer. Okay, now, and that's presumably doing something we could do. That is passing the test that we would test, but we would expect a child to pass for understanding the story. Okay, how does it work? Well, the computer has in its data bank, in addition to the story, it's got a representation of how things go on in restaurants called a restaurant script. And it matches the story and the question against the restaurant script before it gives the answer. Now, what are we to make of this? Well, what I call the strong AI people, and I'm really not sure Maggie is one of them, but the people who are sort of the gung-ho fanatics in AI say, this proves that the computer literally understands the story. Now, I think I can demonstrate conclusively that it proves no such thing, and in fact that the computer doesn't understand the story.
And
Here's how it goes.
is that understanding without inverted
No
commas?
quotes here. I
No
mean,
kind
this
of
is
funny
the honest to
understanding.
John understanding.
Right.
I mean, and to their credit, a lot of people in AI insist that we are using these words in their literal sense. Simon and Newell say the understanding we attribute to the computer is the same understanding we attribute to human beings. Okay, what I ask you to imagine is this. I like to do it in the first person and have everybody do it from their own point of view. Imagine I'm locked in a room, and I got a huge box full of Chinese symbols. I don't know any Chinese, just so many squiggle signs to me. Now they bring in another box full of Chinese symbols, and they give me a bunch of rules in English for matching these symbols. So it says, take a squiggle sign out of box number 1 and go and put it next to a squoggle sign out of box number 2. Just to jump ahead a second, that's called a computational rule over formally specified elements. Okay, now let's suppose they give me in another little batch of Chinese symbols together with some more rules in English for shuffling these symbols around, only this time I give them back the chaps who are giving me all this stuff through the window, I give them back some Chinese symbols. So here I am in my room with my 3 bunches of Chinese symbols. I'm shuffling symbols around. Symbols are coming in, and I'm shuffling them back out. Now imagine, unknown to me, the guys who gave me the first box call it a restaurant script. The second box they call a story about a restaurant. The third bunch of symbols they call questions about the story. The rules in English they call the program. The answer, the stuff that I give them back through the window they call answers to the questions about the story. And me they call the computer. Now let's suppose that after a while they get so good at writing the program and I get so good at shuffling symbols that my answers to the questions are indistinguishable from native Chinese speakers. So the story comes in, I don't know what it means, just a bunch of symbols. But the question follows, did the guy in the restaurant eat the egg foo young? And I give back the symbol that means, no, the guy didn't eat the egg foo young. Now, I pass the test for understanding the story, but I don't understand a word of Chinese.
I think that is the Turing test.
That's so-called
Could you say
Turing
a word
test.
about that?
Well, Alan Turing, a great British mathematical genius, invented the test for determining whether or not we should attribute understanding to the computer, and the test was, could the computer fool an expert? So let's suppose that I can fool the experts. My answers to the questions are as good as those of native Chinese speakers. Imagine they even give me a question of the form, do you understand Chinese? And I give them back answers that mean in Chinese, of course I understand Chinese. Why do you guys keep asking me these stupid questions? Can't you see I'm passing the Turing test? Now, here's the punchline. This is the point of the whole analysis. I do not understand a word of Chinese. And if I don't understand Chinese in this example, neither does any computer. Because the computer has exactly what I have. The computer has that and nothing more. It has a set of formal rules for manipulating symbols. It takes symbols as input, it manipulates the symbols, it gives symbols as output. And if I don't understand Chinese, which I obviously don't, there's no way any other digital computer could understand Chinese or anything else, because all it has is uninterpreted formal symbols. Or just to put this again in one last sentence, and that is, what the computer has, and Maggie described this very well with the programs, is a syntax and not a semantics. What it's got is a set of formal rules for manipulating uninterpreted formal symbols, but what human beings have is not just a bunch of symbols. We know what the symbols mean. You give me a story in English and I know what it means.
So what the computer has is rules for putting terms together, but no rules specifying what terms stand for, something like that.
And furthermore, it couldn't, because suppose you tried to give a computer an interpretation of the story. So you feed in more symbols that say in Chinese, the symbol for egg foo young means a certain kind of egg dish made by putting in a whole lot of soy sauce when you cook the eggs. Well, there's no way that the computer can know any of that, because what it gets is just more symbols. That is, any effort to give an interpretation of the symbols results only in more symbols, and that's by definition what a program is.
Right. Professor Boden, that argument, as you know, has enraged a lot of people. I wonder if it enrages you.
It enrages me a bit too. You shifted, John, from talking about a specific example, the Yale program with the restaurant script and the hamburgers, to talking about any computer. I think that was a bit naughty, because if you stayed talking just about Shank's program, I entirely agree with you. These things do just shift symbols around. They've got no sense of what a restaurant is or a hamburger or anything else. I entirely agree. But then I think there are two things that you would need to add to that sort of program to get a program which was much nearer to having genuine meaning, genuine intentionality. One is, as you said yourself, you've got to have some semantics plugged in. Now, how are you going to do that? I agree you cannot do it in principle purely by adding more formal rules, which by definition aren't interpreted in terms of things in the real world. And I think that you've got to have some causal relationship built into the computer, just as it's built into our brain, into our retina, whatever, in order to establish the semantics, in order to establish the reference. And you've not only got to have sense organs, if you like, taking information in causal commerce with the world, you've also got to have the thing, manipulating things. So if it doesn't, if the egg foo young has a certain chemical in it, it will spit it out and so forth, as we do. Now, if you say that reply isn't really very clear because there's all sorts of questions, all sorts of problems you could raise about whether I really have plugged semantics in, I would say you're absolutely right. But then I would say we don't understand from the philosophical point of view clearly what semantics is in the human case. We don't understand what it is for you or me to refer to that glass. So to be fair, we shouldn't ask for a clearer account of semantics in the AI case than we ask for in the human case. That's the first point I'd make. The second point is that I also think there's a little bit of a sleight of hand when you talk in this dismissive way about shuffling symbols. You imagine this man having the table with, you look up squiggle, squiggle, and he looks across and he finds squoggle, great, squoggle, squoggle goes in this box and out of the window. Even the programs that Yale have at the moment, and as I said before, those are absolutely minute and paltry compared with anything that would have genuine psychological interest in explaining what our understanding might be. Even his programs are much, much more complex than that. And not only much more complex, but they involve a wide range of sorts of internal representations which model, if you like, and we'll put all the scare quotes on, okay, things like beliefs, desires, intentions of the person who's listening to the story and emotionally reacting to it, of the various characters in the story, and anything which is going to be at all a candidate for being the same sort of thing as a human mind has got to have all that. So I entirely agree that his program doesn't have any sort of semantics, but I'd like to know what you'd say about the programs of people like David Marr or Geoffrey Hinton, which are programs, basically they're visual programs, and the point of interest here about them is that they're built in what's called dedicated machines. That's to say, they're built in machines which, like the retina of our eye, has got special little bits in them which react to the light coming in a certain way, so that they can suss out what the three-dimensional shape of something like this is, given that they're only getting a two-dimensional image in. Now, what would you say about that?
Well,
would you say that's nearer?
Let's take both of these points. First of all, the point about complexity. It seems to me my argument has nothing to do with the simplicity or the complexity of the program, because the point is a perfectly general point. The point is that however simple or complex the program is, in order that it be a computer program, it has to be defined purely formally. The whole appeal of artificial intelligence, and indeed the power of computer science, is that one and the same program can be instantiated in an indefinite range of different kinds of hardware precisely because it is defined purely formally. So I would say, as far as the Chinese room is concerned, make the program as complicated as you like. Put in as many representations of as many facts about the world as you like, and the argument remain exactly the same. I still don't know any Chinese because in the way that the system is set up, I have no way of attaching any meaning to the elements in the program, to the symbols that the program operates over, regardless of how complex the program is. So I think the issue of complexity is a red herring, but I don't think that's your main argument. Your main argument, if I understand you correctly, is it's causation plus the program that gives us the mind. Now, I already want to say that is an abandonment of AI as it's traditionally conceived, because now we're not saying the mind is a program. Mind is to brain as program is to hardware. What we're saying is it's program plus causation. So let me consider that, if I may, for a couple of minutes.
Is it causation on the way into the computer or causation on the way out?
The way Maggie had it, I listened very carefully, the way
Right.
Maggie had it is both. And I think that's a more powerful, that's the argument I'd like to challenge, because that's a more powerful argument.
So if you had a computer with a good program attached to a robot,
Right.
and it was causally affected by the environment, and in turn acted causally so that it behaved,
Right.
then on Professor Boden's view, it would understand in inverted commas, and on your view, it would be nowhere near it. Is
That's
that it?
right. Let me go through what I think would be the strongest version of Maggie's case. Imagine a robot, and it's got television cameras attached to its eyes, and it's got a motor apparatus attached to the computer in its skull, and it takes in visual stimuli, and let it use the MAR program to process the visual stimuli. It goes through the primal sketch and all of those things, and then it has motor output based on the set of interfaces between the sensory input and the motor output. In short, the way we've described it is much like the way a lot of people who believe in the computer theory of the brain describe the way that our brain mediates sensory inputs and motor outputs. Okay, I want to say the Chinese room applies exactly to that case. Imagine that in this robot, there's a big room in the robot's skull, and I am in that room. And what comes into me from these from the television sets are a lot of Chinese symbols, and I have no idea where they come from. I'm just paid to sit in this room and follow the instructions and shuffle the symbols around. Now, I then pass back certain symbols or put them in the appropriate slots and push the appropriate buttons, and unknown to me, what I'm doing is mediating the sensory input to a motor output. But all the same, what I have is what any digital computer has: formal symbols, uninterpreted, and you can give them any causation you like. As long as there's no mental representation of that causal relationship, they give me no way of attaching any meaning to the symbols. So let's take an actual case here. Here I am, and I'm the robot's brain now, or if you like, its homunculus. And the robot eats egg foo young at this point, and a symbol comes into me that means egg foo young. Unless I have some way of knowing the causal history of that symbol, that is, unless I have some mental representation of the causal relationship, I still don't learn any meanings of any words. That is, as long as the form of causation isn't mental causation, that is, as long as it's just ordinary physical causation, it won't give me the meanings of any symbols.
Well, I mean,
meanings seem to be the crux here.
Yes, I mean, can I make two responses to that, John? The first is that you've weakened your homunculus. In the story that you just told us, you aren't the robot. You aren't even the robot's brain. You are a subsystem in the robot's brain. Now, there are lots of subsystems in our brain, lots of distinguishable psychological processes which are used, for example, in understanding a sentence or even in working out what the syntax of the sentence is. Now, nobody would want to claim, I think, that one of those processes actually understood what syntax was in the sense in which you and I, as human beings, understand it. So that you cannot cheat by cutting off the semantics, by ignoring the fact that there are these causal relationships with the outside world with this robot, and having a truncated homunculus where you've deliberately, got rid of the semantics. That's the first thing I'd say. And the second thing I'd say is that when we talk about causation here, it's very important to realize that there are two sorts of causation that we need. One, which we need to get the meaning in, is the plugging into the world, the causal commerce with the world in the way that we just talked about, what you might call pure physical causation, that light comes into my eyes, makes things happen on my retina, and that this body in the world touches that and it moves in physical space, okay? But in between that, there is psychological causation, what you called mental causation. Now, I would want to say that psychological causation is best understood as a series of computations which ultimately are anchored in processes with a genuine causal semantics, if you like, of the sort that I've been mentioning. But when Ma, for example, talks about vision, he doesn't just talk about the way in which the light affects the cells in the retina. He then goes on, as you know, to talk about a number of different levels of representation in the visual system, which are needed even just to work out something so simple as what is the three-dimensional shape of that glass. And each of those levels of representation is defined by him very carefully in terms of a set of symbols, which might conceivably have been different, and each of which is defined in terms of the more primitive symbols at the level below. And ultimately, of course, you've got the level at which the eye is actually functioning as a physical transducer, namely, you've got a plugging in of your semantics causally into the world. But we mustn't forget that there's physical causation in that sense, which is crucial, but there's also mental, or I would prefer to say computational causation.
The crucial point in my analysis is that since the formal computer program has no semantic or mental content by definition, then any artificial system that is supposed to give it mental content will have to do something which is equivalent to what the human brain does.
Yes.
Now, that's because that's what the human brain does. Right. But on the way that you've described it, where, and incidentally, in my reading, for example, I was supposed to be the whole brain. That is, it isn't that there are a whole lot of other brains in there. I am the entire brain. I do all the MAR processing as well as other sorts of processing. Now, on that way of describing it, there is no way that the causation plus the symbols could produce any mental content, because there's nothing in the system that performs functions equivalent to those of the human brain. Now, let me take these two propositions, because they are crucial to the argument. We got one out at the beginning, namely, syntax is not semantics. The syntax of the program by itself doesn't give us semantics.
Right.
Now, the second proposition, which is implicit in my account, is brains do it. Brains cause minds. Now, if you take those two together, then we know that the way that the brain does it can't be solely by manipulating syntax, because we know that the syntax isn't enough by itself. Now, what you suggested is, well, let's add causation to the syntax, and that way we'll get what the brain does. But the answer to that is, the only way it would do it would be if you added something that was more than what any digital computer has, namely something that was biochemically the functional equivalent of the human brain.
Well,
I think at this point I have to say that your answer will come to that in just a few moments when we will come back. John, you were saying before that certainly programs aren't sufficient for mentality, to wrap it up rather quickly, but on top of that, that there's some limit or there's some restraint such that only certain sorts of things could conceivably have consciousness or mentality. And I think, Margaret, you were keen to suggest that he was mistaken about that.
Well, not about that in the abstract, but I didn't like the way that John put it, because he talked about systems having the functional equivalent of the biochemical nature of the brain. And I think that that could easily be taken as a mystification, even if a materialist mystification. Of course it's true that if visual pigments that you find in eyes were the only chemicals in the universe that were capable of responding to light, right, then only brains could support vision. Certainly that's true. And there may, as a matter of empirical fact, be certain sorts of chemical interchanges going on in our brains which can't have any sort of functional equivalent anywhere else. But I see absolutely no reason whatsoever to believe this. I mean, the important point is not what is the biochemical nature of the brain, but what are the functions which that biochemistry is subsuming, is supporting. What are the computational functions it's supporting? And I see no reason whatsoever to expect that there's something special or magic about protoplasm, such that there are certain computational functions which only it, in principle, can perform.
There's an interesting way that I think your remark begs the question by saying that what the brain does are perform computational functions. So let's go over this. There are two propositions that form the basis of my argument. Both of them seem to me to be obviously true, and what I'm really trying to do is work out their consequences. One is, syntax is not the same as semantics. You don't get semantics from syntax alone. The second is, just as a matter of biological fact, brains cause minds. That is, specific brain processes cause mental states. Now, if you put those two together, you don't get the result, and I certainly didn't mean to imply that only brains could cause minds, that a system would have to have a brain like ours to have a mind. But you do get the following result. It's a trivial consequence of the proposition that brains cause minds, and that is, anything else that was capable of causing mental states would have to have powers, specific powers, equivalent to those of the brain.
Right.
Now that maybe Martians do it by having a lot of green slime in their head, or maybe you could do it with silicon chips. But you know that if the brain does it, then anything else that did it would have to have powers equal to the brain. Now if you go back to the first proposition, namely syntax is enough, you know that the way that the brain does it can't be solely computationally, because you know that all the computation does is operate over formal symbols. You furthermore know, and this is another logical consequence, that if you build an artifact, a robot, or something else that did it, you would have to have more than just the formal syntactical processes. You'd have to have something that duplicated the powers of the brain. Now it becomes a question, well, what kind of systems would do that? Now here's where I really part company with AI. The strong AI position is any hardware whatever that had the right program, and I gather you want to add to that, any hardware whatever that had the right program together with the right causal relations to the external world. Okay, but that would have the consequence, for example, that let's suppose we build one hell of a big computer out of old beer cans. You can make computers out of anything. You can make them out of men sitting on high stools, or you can make them out of water running through pipes. So let's build a computer out of old Watney's cans. I don't know if we're supposed to mention particular labels, but anyway, old beer cans.
You've done it.
I've done it. Okay. We have millions, billions of old beer cans banging together, and they're powered by windmills, and we got the right inputs. We have transducers that transduce photons, so we got a perception of light. Now, I want to say it just seems to me incredible that this system of beer cans would have the biochemical properties of the human brain. And I want to say, now here's my main objection to AI. AI doesn't say, for all we know, beer cans might have thoughts and feelings. What AI says, if they've got the right organization, they must have thoughts and feelings, because that's all there is to having thoughts and feelings, is instantiating the right program.
Professor Boden, are you committed to the view that a pile of old beer cans with the right causal connections
And the right program.
and the right program might be said to
Must have.
have a mind or whatever?
Well, in principle, in as strong a sense as any computer could be said to have a mind. I mean, I already said earlier in the program that I personally wouldn't want to say that it did for basically moral reasons, but as I said, it isn't, in my view, it isn't a factual impossibility. But can I pass, actually, John, from the strong AI position which we've been talking about, and which actually isn't really my position anyway, speaking personally, from the strong AI position to the weak AI position? See, I personally am not primarily interested in computers. I'm interested in the human mind. I'm interested in how it works, how it relates to the brain, and what the hell goes on up here, right? And I'm interested in AI because I think it gives us a way, far and away the most promising way that I can see at the moment, of thinking about these things and of asking a new set of questions using some of the concepts that computer science has given us, and of making hypotheses, suggesting hypotheses which are much more rich, much more precise, much more complex than any we've had before, and which also have their own dynamism. I mean, you can see what their results are by putting them into a computer and letting the thing run. And I think from the point of view of theoretical psychology, this is very interesting. I've already mentioned that I think that some of the work in low-level vision in AI has been psychologically very useful. Not that it's given us the answers about just what's going on, even about that, but that it's given us some very interesting ways of asking new questions. And there's already been, I think, some genuine advance there. But let's get off that topic, because somebody might say, well, you know, who's really interested in how you get from 2D to 3D? It's pretty boring. Let's take something like, I don't know, creativity. Which is one of the things that people always bring up as what they regard as an obvious counterexample. You know, you couldn't possibly come to understand human creativity better by thinking about it in this sort of way. Well, I'd like to make 2 points there. First of all, there's no alternative, because it seems to me there are two theories, in quotes, about creativity at the moment, neither of which are at all helpful. One is basically it's divine, I mean, Bernard Levin, the theatre critic, actually stated so in 2 pieces in the Times a couple of years ago when the play Amadeus about Mozart was running. He actually claimed creativity is divine and couldn't possibly be explained by a human psychology. The other is that it's not divine, but it's sort of superhuman. It's something special. It's intuition. It's something which perhaps all of us have, but some of us have to a much greater degree, Mozart, for example. But it's unanalyzable, it's special, and again, it's not something which science, never mind computers, which science could explain. Now, that seems to me to be defeatist. I mean, it may be true, but we'd better look a bit harder before we decide that it's true. And I'd like to ask, how intuition works, what it means to say that something was found out by intuition. And I'll just take one example and just for you to kick around. I'm sure you'll be happy to. A program written by a man called Lennart. I pick it not because it's a very, very impressive program, but because it's the most impressive program so far in this sort of area. It's a program which explores mathematical ideas. It doesn't just do sums, according to preset rules. It actually kicks around the ideas in its mind, so to speak, changes them, transforms them, combines them, and asks itself from time to time, have I got anything here which looks as though it might be interesting? And if it finds something which it thinks might be interesting in terms of the criteria it has for mathematical interestingness, then it concentrates on that and tries to prove theorems and so on. Now, to cut a very long story short and omitting all the technicalities, this thing, has come up with a large number of ideas which it labels as being interesting, which mathematicians also would agree are interesting, things like prime numbers and square roots and so on. It's even come up with one theorem which was a new theorem in the theory of numbers. Nobody in the whole history of mathematics had ever thought of this before.
It's certainly passing the Turing test. Then,
it's passing the Turing test. Now, and it's doing this, as I say, by having rules which are, if you like, rules for exploring. Mm-hmm. And I think basically that's what creativity is. It's a question of exploring the structures in your mind, putting some of the concepts together, changing some of the constraints on your structures that are in your mind, not necessarily consciously. And that this is what's churning underneath in our minds, underneath what we call intuition.
Well, it seems to me we've now got several pieces on the board. I'm not quite sure where your final position on strong AI, that is the view that computers literally have thoughts and feelings, is, but I want to insist that even in this case of the theorem-proving program, if it really is a formal program, I mean, we've had these theorem-proving programs for quite a long time now, it would not be a case of actually having thoughts. It would be a case of simulating the production of proofs. I mean, the actual prints out proofs.
Look,
but let me finish.
But I think it was the creative production.
Okay, let's talk about creativity.
Well, A, it wasn't a theorem prover in the ordinary sense, but B, I'm not interested for the moment in the question about whether or not you can say that that program is really creative. What I'm interested in is whether or not we can understand human creativity better by thinking about it in terms of this analogy, if you like.
Okay, and that seems to me a factual question. I mean, this seems to be an empirical question, and I'll try and state it as precisely as I can, and that is, are the principles on which the human brain operates, that is to say, those principles that are crucial for such things as creativity, are they fundamentally, or do they fundamentally involve some digital elements? That is, let's grant for the sake of argument that strong AI is false, that the computer doesn't literally have thoughts and feelings. Now then, well, what good is it in the study of human psychology? Well, one line would be, and it's one that I would agree with, it's a very useful tool. It's a useful tool in studying human beings in the way that it's a useful tool in studying avalanches or patterns of rain in the Midlands or the economy of South American countries. It's just a very useful tool. But there's a stronger view, which I think you hold, and that is, we have very good reason to believe that even if the program isn't sufficient for having mental states, that it's nonetheless necessary for having mental states, so that we can study creativity by studying machines. While they don't literally have thoughts and feelings, nonetheless do something analogous to producing human creativity. Now, let me tell you why I'm a little bit suspicious about that. First of all, there's a long history of identifying whatever is most puzzling to us about the mind and the brain with the latest technology.
Sure.
So in my childhood, I mean, nowadays we're told the brain is a digital computer. When I was a boy, we were always told it was a telephone switchboard. What else could it be? And if you go back to Freud, Freud always identifies the brain, or analogizes the brain to electromagnetic and hydraulic devices. Sherrington identified the brain with telegraph systems. Leibniz compared the brain to a mill. And I'm told there were some Greeks who thought the brain functioned like a catapult. So we ought to be suspicious of
Some brains do.
of fixing our model of the brain on whatever's the latest technology. And the real question is this. It seems to me that I haven't seen a shred of evidence to show that psychology is best understood on the computational metaphor. Regardless of the truth or falsity of strong AI, the claim that the key to understanding psychology is to see the operation of the human mind on digital principles seems to me to have been totally unsupported.
When you said that, of course you agree that the computer is a useful tool for thinking about the mind, just like it's a useful tool for thinking about hurricanes or whatever. Now, I suppose what you meant by that was it's a useful tool because it gives you precision and it can work out the results of your theories for you quickly and so on. I mean, which is not to be sneezed at. No other psychological method has got it. Agreed. But I certainly would want to claim, I'm sure you dispute, that it gives us more than this in the case of psychology, though not in the case of hurricanes. Namely, that some of the concepts that were developed in computer science in order to build these machines to do vaguely interesting things are the best that we've got at the moment. The best, the most promising concepts that we've got at the moment for thinking about what goes on in the mind.
I think they're not the best set of tools, and I want to suggest some better tools. And I think, in fact, one of the pernicious things about AI, even though it is a useful tool, one of the pernicious things is it distracts attention from what really are the fundamental problems in psychology. Now, I believe the basic notion in understanding the operation of the human mind is the intentionality of the mind. That is, the ability of mental states and events to represent objects and states of affairs in the world. So I'm thinking not just of belief and desire and hope and fear, but also of perception and voluntary action. Now, this feature of all of these things, namely that they refer beyond themselves, which philosophers and psychologists call intentionality, that feature seems to me the fundamental feature in understanding human psychology and human behavior. It's no exaggeration to say, at least I think it's no exaggeration to say, that intentionality is as fundamental to psychology as atomic theory is to physics, or as the theory of tectonic plates is to geology. Now, here's the problem with AI. Instead of addressing intentionality on its own terms, what it does is address a formal analog. And it gets us to think that really what we really ought to be studying is not, for example, consciousness. Notice there's very little about consciousness in AI and very little about it in contemporary psychology, partly because they've bought this information processing model. You have said very little about consciousness in this discussion. But conscious and unconscious forms of intentionality are the fundamental notions that we're going to have to use in explaining human behavior. Now, consciousness and intentionality are themselves grounded in the brain. They're grounded in the neurophysiology. And the great illusion that AI palms off on us, it's an illusion that's persistent in the social sciences throughout this century, is that in addition to the actual functioning of the brain to produce mental states, and in addition to the mental states themselves in all of their tediousness and glory, that is actual conscious and unconscious mental states, that there's got to be some intermediate realm. Now, for a long time it was supposed to be behavior, and now it's supposed to be some computer program that's supposed to mediate between the neurophysiology, between the level of the hardware, the level of the plumbing, and the level of the mental phenomena themselves. So I want to say that our basic notion in understanding human beings is the one we've known all along, is not the idea of a formal computational process operating over some abstract formal symbols. There's no reason to suppose that that's how human beings work. The way they actually work, as far as we know anything about it, is first they've got brains, they've got these neurophysiological engines, and those brains produce mental states, which themselves function causally by way of their intentionality.
I quite agree that from the philosophical point of view, the basic notion of psychology is intentionality. I would say not consciousness, intentionality. Although although, of course, any adequate theoretical psychology has got to be able to deal with consciousness. So I entirely agree with that. And I would use that as a stick to beat those sorts of psychology, like, for instance, behaviorism, which have had no place at all for that. But I want to say a few things about that. First of all, intentionality isn't the same thing as consciousness. For example, the experiments...
No, we agree on that. We agree on that. There are forms of intentionality that aren't
There are
conscious.
forms of intentionality that aren't conscious. That's the first thing. The second thing is that really nearly all theoretical psychologists, including Freud, took consciousness for granted at the philosophical level. They took it for granted. After taking it for granted at the philosophical level, some of them went on to ignore it at the empirical theoretical level too. Some of them didn't. But certainly it's not true that theoretical psychology is only concerned with consciousness. Also, it's not true that AI or computational psychology influenced by AI is the only form of psychology that has taken that philosophical fact, if you like, or that philosophical domain for granted.
No one says it's the only branch of psychology. My point was...
Okay, now let me say something more positive than that. I think, now obviously we disagree, one of the specific reasons why I find AI of philosophical and of psychological interest is that it seems to me to be a promising way of thinking precisely about intentionality.
Yes, and the way that it does it, the way that it does it, and this is really one of the consequences of the Chinese room argument, is that we can now show this. The way it does it is by changing the subject. Instead of taking intentionality on its own terms, what it does is try to construct a formal analog of intentionality.
But we don't know what intentionality is on its own terms.
Well, we do indeed.
We have no philosophical account of it.
But we do indeed. Well, I've just published a philosophical account of it, and I'm sure not the first.
Well, we have no non-controversial, universally accepted account of intentionality.
We have no non-controversial account of anything in this field. I mean, so that's hardly an objection. The point, however, is this. In the case of AI, what we have is the illusion that we don't have to study intentionality on its own terms. That is to say, either in terms of its own logical and psychological structure on the one hand, or its physiological underpinnings on the other. What we can study is this purely formal analog, which we study completely abstractly.
Well, I would like one example of a flourishing or a historical form of theoretical psychology which has done better.
Well, Freud in psychology, for example, uses intentionality throughout. Now,
it assumes intentionality throughout. Yes, indeed.
What Freud does is very interesting. And incidentally, I'm certainly no fan of Freud, and what I think you're pointing to is the general impoverishment of psychology as a discipline, one thing I entirely agree with. But from William James through Freud, just to mention two prominent examples, much of the best work that's been done on human psychology uses straightforward notions of intentionality. James and Freud don't use the jargon.
Right.
Freud often talks as if he's doing some kind of hydraulics of the mind. He uses all these electromagnetic and hydraulic metaphors. But when you actually get to the clinical practice in Freud, the explanations are intentionalistic.
Yes, but you see, I quite agree with that. And if you asked me to name one psychologist who's closest to AI, of course not counting the very recent ones who know about it, I would pick Freud. Precisely because Freud was concerned with the transformation of symbols. He was concerned with the relationship of meanings, with the way in which symbolic meanings come together and are compared, and the way in which a memory is structured, and so on and so on and so on. All his stuff about parapraxis, slips of the tongue, all this stuff seems to me, in principle, makes very good computational sense.
Yeah,
so I think it's a very strong example for my case.
Freud and AI are both talking about symbols rests on a very deep pun. I might almost say it's a Freudian pun. Because when Freud talks about symbols, he meant real symbols. Something actually stands for something else. Now, the problem with AI is, and here we're back to the Chinese room argument, there's no way that the symbols in the program can stand for anything. They're strictly uninterpreted formal symbols. So the idea that what we've got is both Freud and AI are concerned with symbols, that's a pun on the word symbol, because in the AI sense of symbol, namely an uninterpreted formal counter, they're not symbols at all.
Well, when Rutherford said the atom was a planetary system, he didn't mean that the thing in the middle was emitting light.
Yeah, but there you go again with the metaphor. Of course, metaphors are often useful. The difficulty is at some point we want to know what is literally true. Now, I want to say, as far as we know anything about it, Freud has got one thing, whatever his other faults are, literally right. Namely, human beings are symbolic animals. They use some things to stand for other things. That is not captured in AI.
Well, he's got it right, but because he's stating it, and we all agree that it's true at an intuitive level. What he hasn't provided, and what I think, with the possible exception of your good self, no philosopher since has provided, is a universally accepted, clear, complete account at the philosophical level of just what intentionality is, and that we're still waiting for.
But there is a further difficulty here. You apparently recognize that there is some phenomenon which you think Professor Searle hasn't quite got right. You do recognize its existence.
Indeed.
Now, whether or not it's yet been clarified, I take it the dispute between you is whether or not it can in fact be explained in terms of programs and computer simulation. And I'm not
the
very
idea that
clear
it's got to be universally accepted.
Well, I wouldn't want to say,
Yeah.
I don't know that I'd want to say it quite as strongly as that. I'd certainly be prepared to say that I think that it's likely that we'll develop our understanding of it better by thinking about it in these terms.
But that's
yes.
another promissory note.
Sure, it's a promissory note. Science is full of them.
Yeah, but what we're interested in is, what do we know? What can we actually
what we're
say with some
interested in
confidence?
is, what can we find out and how?
And what is the best way to proceed? Now,
Right.
I am saying, and I think you agree with me, the best way to proceed must involve the examination of intentionality.
Yes.
And you also agree with me, no program has intentionality.
Yes,
so it
but
looks
I
like
also
what we're
say
doing,
that no atom is really a solar
but
system.
we don't need it to be a solar system, because what we do is study the atom on its own terms, and precisely what I'm recommending is we better start studying intentionality on its own terms and not in terms of some currently fashionable mechanical analogy. So I really don't see any basis for a disagreement between us if you really agree with me that intentionality is the subject matter of psychology. There's no way AI can deal with intentionality except by analogy.
Well, science moves by analogy.
And sometimes it moves forward, and sometimes it moves forward by making literal investigations of the phenomena at hand. I like your analogy with Rutherford, because if we just tried to investigate the atom by looking at the solar system, we wouldn't have got very far. At some point, you have to actually look at the atom.
True.
Now, I am saying, if you want to investigate intentionality, you won't get very far, you're not likely to get very far, just by doing simulations and analogs. You better look at the phenomenon itself.
Yes, but
to look at the thing just slightly differently, we have this fundamental feature of our mental life, which you both appear to agree on, that is intentionality. Taking something, I mean, one might speak of it, I suppose, in terms of aboutness or directedness, as indeed Professor Searle does. Now, we clearly have that feature, and he says computers don't have it, or programs don't have it. And you tend to come back and say, well, nonetheless, they are rather useful ways of approaching the solution of that problem. And it keeps sounding a little bit as if you think they come a bit close to taking something to stand for something else, or come a bit close to directing themselves onto an object.
Well, I don't think they do when they are just programs that are rules for manipulating formal patterns which don't have any causal plugging into the world. But I think that when they do have a causal plugging into the world, and there are already a few examples of this, then they do really begin to have something which is interestingly closer to intentionality. And I also think that the human mind seems to me to be a very good bet, at least from the methodological point of view, that the human mind is such that overlying the basic causal grounding in the transducers and the voluntary action and so on and so forth, there are mental processes going on, and the best way that we currently have of thinking about just what those mental processes might be specifically and how they work and in what order they work and so forth are computations similar in nature in significant ways to the sorts of computations that you have even in current formal programs, like, for instance, Shank's program that you mentioned right at the beginning.
Let me just respond to that. It seems to me I am really having some trouble getting your theory into focus, because I thought you agreed in the beer can phase of our argument that if the beer can had the right causal relations on the right input and output, then it would have to have all the intentionality that human beings have. I thought that was agreed on, and your only objection to that was you wouldn't feel morally about beer cans the way you feel about other people. And I wouldn't feel morally about them either, because I think it's obvious that they don't have any conscious thoughts and feelings or unconscious thoughts and feelings. Okay, now it seems to me your position's weaker than the beer can phase, because now it seems to me you're saying, well, we sort of get the best available way of studying intentionality by doing this. But now that is not really the same thesis. Indeed, it doesn't look like it's consistent with it.
The strong AI thesis isn't my thesis, so...
Yeah, but I thought you accepted it in the beer can phase of our discussion. But now then, the second objection I wanted to make is not just that the position is inconsistent, but that it begs the question precisely to say the best way of studying it is to study formal computer analogs. That's what's in dispute. What I'm saying is, no, there are two better ways of studying it. One is study the phenomena itself. Picking up your example, Rutherford would have made a mistake if he'd stuck looking at the solar system instead of investigating atoms.
Yes, but
let's
the point
study
is that
the
when
phenomena
he
of
investigated
intentionality
atoms,
themselves. And secondly, another way to study it is to study how it actually works in the brain, what the actual causal basis in the brain. But now if you've got those two, if you actually got a study of intentionality on its own terms, and you got a study of its causal basis in the brain, then what would be the grounds for saying the best way to study intentionality would be to study its analogs?
Well, the point is, of course, Rutherford would have got nowhere if he'd only looked at the planetary system. What he did was to look at the atom, but in looking at the atom, he made use of the concepts he already had, which referred to the planetary system. So that's the analogy.
So it's nice to have an analogy to start
and
off.
And the second thing is...
Once we get started, then we can forget about the analogy and go on to the real thing.
I mean, it seems to be a very important point to make. Of course we must look at the brain, of course. And one of the interesting things about Marr, for example, who we've mentioned, is that he makes a concerted attempt. I mean, never mind whether it's successful, he makes a concerted and serious attempt to link what he says with what's known and what might be hypothesized about neurophysiology at a very detailed level. Now, it seems to me what you have to ask about the brain is not just what happens on the causal physical level, if you like, between this neuron and that, but what mental processes, what psychological processes, I would like to say what computational processes, but anyway, what functions are these causal processes subserving? That's what we have to ask. And that is not a question which can be posed at the purely physical level. It's a question which is posed at the psychological level. And it's a question where, again, I can only repeat what I've said before, it seems to me that a very promising way of posing those very questions is by making use of some of the concepts that have been given to us by computer science and AI.
Well, let me just respond to that briefly by advancing another research project. One way to start off on any serious research project is ask yourself, well, what do you know so far? So that we can then use that as a springboard into the unknown. Well, two things we know so far is we have brains and they produce mental states, and we have mental states with intentionality, and they are responsible for our behavior. Now, it seems to me that right there gives you a research program. It tells you, okay, if you want to understand psychology, you're going to have at least two levels to work on. The brain, how does it work in the plumbing, and intentionality, how does it work at the level of mental states, whether conscious or unconscious. Now, if somebody then says, aha, but you should devote most of your effort to a third level, not the best way, I use your expression here, to study this is neither to get into the brain nor to study the intentionality, but to study this intermediate level of the program, I would say there isn't any reason to suppose that that promissory note is the one that's going to have the biggest payoff. Now, of course, it's possible that anything might develop, but if we're just looking at what we now know and what is the most intelligent way to place our resources, it seems to me we're much better off proceeding to study the matter at hand, namely intentionality and its basis in the brain.
Well, we're betting on different horses.
Thank you, Professor Boden. Thank you, Professor Searle. Good night.